Hi, and you're now with the Forerunner Chronicles. Alright everybody, this video is an answer to a question that I've been receiving from a plethora of people out there for quite some time now, so I figured today's definitely the day to answer the question. And the question has to deal with the Sabbath, like you didn't already know that because you read the title of the video. But listen, this question on the Sabbath is really interesting because it's multifaceted. It starts like this. Now, how can we know of a certainty that the Sabbath of the 10 Commandments is not a lunar Sabbath? And what we're talking about here is a Sabbath that is determined by the moon, okay? And how can we know without counting from the very first day of creation all the way up until present day which day the seventh day of the week really is with accuracy? And hasn't the calendar been changed, Forerunner? And isn't the calendar changed every 4 years? Doesn't this have some effect upon which day the seventh day of the week is? Now, these are some good questions, and hence, I have some good answers. So let's start at the beginning of this thing. Is the Sabbath of the 10 Commandments a lunar Sabbath? The answer to that question is no. The Sabbath of the 10 Commandments is not a lunar Sabbath. How do we know this? All we have to do is simply read the Sabbath commandment, which is the fourth commandment of the 10 Commandments, which are contained in the book of Exodus chapter 20. In Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8, we are told, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work, thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, nor thy manservant, thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thine gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested on the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Now, clearly from the scripture, God has told all of humanity that they should rest at the end of every 7-day weekly cycle to honor and keep holy the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. Not the Sabbath of the Jews, not the Sabbath of the Israelites, but the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. Now, you might say, how do we know of a certainty still that we're talking about literal days and not something that has to do with lunar movements? We know by looking at verse 11, because it says, in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested on the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. This verse of scripture directs our minds all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. Because in Genesis chapter 1, we are given the very detailed account of how God created this world in 6 literal days. And then in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 4, we are told, and God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it he had rested from all his work which God had created and made. And notice there that the seventh day is the only day that God gave a proper name to. And that name is, that's right, the Sabbath day. So for us to insinuate that we're not talking about literal days here and lunar movements instead, for us to insinuate that means that we are denying, we are rejecting the testimony of Genesis chapter 1 that God created this world in 6 literal days and then rested on the seventh day. And if we reject the testimony of Genesis chapter 1, in essence, in a very real way, we are helping to vindicate the false satanic theory of evolution. And you don't want to be responsible for doing that. So let's go forward with this thing. Now, do you have to count from the very first day of creation all the way up until present day, every single day, to know of a certainty which day the seventh day of the week is? With accuracy. No, you don't have to do that. All you have to do is read the Bible, everybody. In the Gospels, we are clearly told that Jesus Christ and his disciples were Sabbath keepers. They kept the Sabbath. Now the question we need to ask is, did Jesus and the disciples know what the days of the week were with accuracy? The answer to that question is yes, they did. And we can find the answer to this question, in answer to what I just said. We can prove that rather in the book of Luke chapter 23 starting at verse 50. Now before I get there, I just want to paint the backdrop here for you. In Luke chapter 23, we are given the account of how Jesus was crucified on the cross. Now in Luke chapter 23 and verse 50, we're told about a man by the name of Joseph of Arimathea. All right. Now Joseph of Arimathea went unto Pontius Pilate and asked him for the body of Jesus Christ after his crucifixion to be taken down off the cross. And we are told in Luke chapter 23 and verse 53 that and he took it down and wrapped it in linen and laid it in a sepulchre that was hewn in stone, wherein never man before was laid. And that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. And the women also which came with him from Galilee followed after, and beheld the sepulchre, and how his body was laid. And they returned and prepared spices and ointments, and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment. Now, if we look at Luke chapter 24 and verse 1, we find some more extremely valuable information. In Luke chapter 24 and verse 1, it says there, now upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came unto the sepulchre, bringing the spices which they had prepared, and certain others with them. And they found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre. Why? Because Jesus had already risen from the grave. And when did Jesus rise from the grave? Very early in the morning on the first day of the week, which many people call Easter Sunday, after that pagan day Ishtar, but nonetheless they call it Easter Sunday. Now, what day preceded the first day of the week? Well, according to Luke chapter 23 and verse 56, the Sabbath day, the same Sabbath day that those women that brought spices and all of the disciples rested according to the commandment. And what day preceded the Sabbath day? Well, according to Luke chapter 23 and verse 54, the preparation day. The preparation day was Friday, because the Sabbath is supposed to be kept from Friday sunset all the way to Saturday sunset, and then after that comes the first day of the week, which we know as the pagan Sunday. You can't get around it. That's the reality. Now, some people out there might say, well, that was in Jesus' times, and that was like 2,000 years ago. How can we know that the same weekly cycle that Jesus and his disciples were abiding by is the same weekly cycle that you and I are abiding by today? And I'm going to prove to you how we can know this with an absolute certainty.